Hi everyone, this is Svava Brooks. I'm so happy you're joining us today for the Take Your Power Back Interview Summit. See, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been on the healing journey for over 20 years, and I am very passionate about helping survivors how to live, love, and succeed after childhood abuse and trauma. See, I do remember how hard it was to find the resources and the tools to heal from the impacts of the abuse. And that's why I started these interview series where I am talking to wonderful experts and professionals who are willing to share their unique approach to healing and thriving after childhood trauma. So let's get started. See, today I'm talking to a very special person, Beverly Engel. Welcome to the program today, Beverly.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. I was very excited to have you join me to talk about all your experience. And I want to tell our audience a little more about you before, of course, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share more yourself. But for our audience here, Beverly Engel is an internationally recognized psychotherapist and acclaimed advocate for victims of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. She's the author of 21 self-help books, including 4 best-selling books on emotional abuse. Her latest book is entitled, It Wasn't Your Fault. Well, I like that one. It Wasn't Your Fault. Freeing Yourself from the Shame of Childhood Abuse with the Power of Self-Compassion. And this book, see here, just came out in January of this year, 2015. Engel is a licensed marriage and family therapist and has been practicing psychotherapy for 35 years. Her books have been honored for various awards, and also in addition to your professional work, Beverly frequently lends her expertise on national television. You've been on Oprah, CNN, and many other TV programs. And in addition to all that, you regularly conduct training workshops throughout the United States and the United Kingdom, both professionally and for lay audience. That's very impressive, and I thank you very, very much for all the work that you do. So there must be a deep, deep passion for this topic, clearly. So I'm curious, and I would like to start by asking you that. Where does the passion come from?
Well, I am a survivor of childhood abuse, both all forms of childhood abuse. Mm-hmm. I originally started focusing on healing my sexual abuse, and that was my very first book. As many therapists will tell you, they got into this profession actually to heal themselves, and I clearly did that. I had a dual passion. One is to help myself, and one was to help other people. Mm-hmm. And my very first book was actually going to be just a handbook that I was going to give my clients, because so many of them were coming and telling me that they were sexually abused at the time. This is way back in the 80s, before it really became, before it came to the forefront of our mentality. And my clients would ask me questions, and I found that I was giving the same answers over and over and over. So I was going to just write a handbook for people, which ended up being my very first book. Once I wrote about sexual abuse, I also became aware that I was getting therapy myself and healing, and I had been healing for years. I realized that emotional abuse was also a really important factor in my life. And I began to write and research and do counseling with people about emotional abuse. So I pretty much have focused on both of those, emotional and sexual abuse.
Yeah, those are very much connected, don't you think?
They can be. They aren't always.
Okay.
They aren't always. I wasn't emotionally abused by my sexual perpetrator.
Okay.
I was emotionally abused by my mother. And I can't honestly tell you which had the worst effect on me. They both had a tremendous impact on my life. That has taken a lifetime to heal. In fact, I would say that I healed from the sexual abuse probably easier and faster than I'm still struggling with the emotional abuse.
Wow.
The emotional abuse has actually been a harder thing to recover from.
Wow. Well, why do you think that is? Do you have an insight to that?
Well, in my case, it was my mother, and it was from the time I was born until I left home. So it was many, many years of emotional abuse. And so it really shaped my personality. It shaped who I was.
Yes.
It shaped what kind of relationships I had. It shaped, who I became. It shaped my career in a positive way. But it really shaped my life. I developed an eating disorder after the sexual abuse, but it also, I found, was connected to the emotional abuse on an even deeper level. So I've had to struggle with that issue a lot more, a lot harder than I have other issues. I went through a period where I was abusing alcohol. I was, abusing sex. I had other addictions along the way, but the eating disorder was the hardest, and that was connected to the emotional abuse.
Well, I can relate in the sense that I do feel like I've healed from the sexual trauma, but underneath it, I'm discovering now there were things that happened when I was just an infant that I'm really kind of connecting to and seeing how that kind of set off the snowball, if you will, and I think it set me up for other things later. But so you heal one layer, then there's another one to tackle.
Right.
So, well, thank you for sharing that. It's really. It's always fascinating to me. And like you say, I do think most of us who go into the helping profession, we're searching for answers for ourselves, but, and hopefully we will heal ourselves in the process and not just focusing on others, it's amazing how that works. But I want to go straight to the latest book that you came out with, because I think it's kind of one of the core issues that we deal with, and that's the issue of shame and how debilitating that is to victims and how we feel about ourselves. So why did you focus on healing shame as opposed to healing, the anger that we often feel, or powerlessness, or sadness?
Yeah. Well, again, it's twofold. Both my own experience that shame has been the hardest thing for me to heal. Both the shame of the sexual abuse, but more importantly, again, the shame of having been emotionally abused, the messages my mother gave me about who I was. I started life with this belief that I was bad, that I was a bad person. And so, of course, after I was sexually abused, I had evidence now that I was bad and really felt horribly shamed by the sexual abuse. But it just goes back to the way my mother treated me earlier. So I wanted to get more help for myself. And so I did a lot of research and workshops and that kind of thing. But I also found that my clients, that the hardest thing for them to heal was their shame. They could get to the place where they could cry and grieve the abuse. They could get to the place where they could get angry at their perpetrators or their abusers or their parents. They could feel the other emotions. But shame is a hard thing to identify. You don't really necessarily, you're not even aware that you're feeling it. It is a feeling, but you don't necessarily feel it like you feel anger or you feel sadness. Some people will have like a shame attack where they feel their face gets red and they feel queasy, and some people almost feel like they want to pass out when they're shamed. But most people don't have physical responses to shame. What happens is it shows up in their life by they become self-critical, they become self-abusive, self-harming, they become unable to take in good things. So they shame themselves by pushing away good relationships, or by pushing away love, or pushing away success because they don't believe they deserve it. So they are attracted to self-destructive kinds of ways of expressing themselves. So it manifests itself in many, many ways in perfectionism. It can manifest in being enraged with other people. We can project our shame onto other people and have unreasonable expectations of our children or our partners. So it just manifests itself in so many really damaging ways. And I wasn't finding a way to help my clients to overcome their shame. There just wasn't really anything out there at the time when I first started researching this. And so when I came upon, first, I've known about compassion and how important compassion is for others. But when I came upon some relatively new research in self-compassion, which was really pretty revolutionary. It was written, the first research was done in 2011, so that's fairly recently. No one had ever researched self-compassion before.
Wow.
They had researched compassion, but not self-compassion. We didn't even know what the term was exactly before that.
Yes.
So a woman named Kristen Neff at the University of Texas did some major research and did wonderful research on it. And from that, a lot of things came out of that. And what I did is I took her research and I adapted it to working with victims of abuse. She did not focus on victims of abuse. She was talking to the general public about shame. And of course, we know that victims of abuse have an even deeper shame and even more debilitating shame than the average person.
That's interesting. So do you think that, the general public carries a level of shame? Like
yes.
Everyone has it? Is that what she found?
Yes. Everybody carries some level of it. And it usually comes out in the form of perfectionism, being self-critical. But abuse survivors and victims will, they take on the self-destructiveness, the self-sabotaging. When they're in a good relationship, they get critical of their partner, or they'll start fights, or they get a good job and they will sabotage it. So some people have a real pattern in their lifetime of sabotaging success. And the self-criticism, self-damaging, self-harm, all of that is much more intense with victims and survivors than it is the general public. But yes, everybody has shame.
So can you then help them see that this feeling, even though it's hard to express the feeling or put your finger on it, help them see how that's connected to that behavior, or is it connected to a belief, or...
I can help them see how it's connected to behaviors.
Okay.
It's pretty easy. Once you talk about being self-destructive or self-sabotaging, survivors really identify with self-sabotaging. They'll say, yeah, I can see how I did that. Because they got involved in self-destructive activities like alcohol, drugs, sex, sexual addiction, they can identify that. So there's an element, there's a crossover between addictions and shame also. There's just about the same time, about, around 2010, 2011, those in the addiction and recovery fields began to realize that shame was a major issue for alcoholics particularly, but for anyone who has any kind of addiction, that shame was actually at the core of those activities. So, it kind of all came together. So it's easy for people to connect it once you point it out. Okay.
And then they are more willing then to have, what do you say, compassion for themselves about it, or?
No, that's why I wrote the book, because Kristen Neff wrote about, she had 3 steps to her self-compassion program. And she didn't have a hierarchy. All 3 steps were important. And one was self-kindness. Well, what I found is that survivors of abuse or victims of abuse are not going to just be able to practice self-kindness just because you tell them it's important. Just because you tell them that self-compassion is the antidote to shame, they're not going to just be able to turn around and do that. So I knew that I had to prepare people to get to the place where they would be willing to be kind to themselves. Because survivors have so much shame, they're not willing to. They don't feel like they deserve it. They feel like self-compassion is like self-pity. In our culture, we have a very strong message that you don't address your suffering. Victims have become a bad word. I'm writing an article on that for Psychology Today right now, because our blog, because victim has become a dirty word. That's right. And people don't want to admit they've been victimized. I mean, God forbid you tell somebody that you're unhappy when they ask you how you're feeling, or, my best example is when, somebody's house was just, blown away by a tornado, and the reporter sticks a microphone in their face and says, well, how are you? And the person says, well, at least I'm grateful we all got out alive, I'll be okay. Because that's what we're being programmed to say. It's not that I'm against gratitude, but instead of saying to us, I'm devastated. I just lost my house. I've just lost everything that I own. I'm going to have to start all over. I feel horrible. We don't want to hear that. So victims aren't allowed to be compassionate toward themselves. They're not allowed to even talk about their suffering. And they're criticized. People are criticized if they're not getting over their problems fast enough, So kind of helping them to understand that they need to give themselves time to address their suffering and to feel the sadness and to feel the grief and to not feel sorry for themselves, but to feel that they deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve to have their pain acknowledged, mostly by themselves, but by others too, but mostly by themselves. So I just developed a whole program of helping them get to the place where they feel like they deserve self-kindness. And so we have to start with self-understanding. We have to help them understand that all their acting out against society or addictions or mistreatment of other people all comes because of the fact that they were abused. It's not an excuse. It's just an acknowledgement that when you don't have any other way of dealing with the shame of abuse or the other feelings that go along with it, then you either act out against society or you act out against yourself, or you self-soothe you self-medicate with alcohol, and you didn't know any better and you didn't have any other tools. So it starts with self-understanding, and then it moves into self-forgiveness. Once you understand why you are the way you are, and I even include in my book things like defining PTSD and defining some of the problems that people have because they've been abused. So it's just kind of an education and a deeper understanding of why I've done what I've done in my life. Why did I treat my own child in a negative way? Why did I pass it on? Why have I become abusive? Or why have I continued to be a victim? So just having self-understanding is the first step. And then we move into self-forgiveness. Once you know why you've done it, you're more likely to be able to forgive yourself for it. Okay. And then self-acceptance. That's a lot about, kind of dealing with our inner critic, dealing with our shadow, the Jungian concept of the shadow, not having expectations of ourselves that are too high. I talk with survivors all the time, and they're just so down on themselves because they haven't accomplished more. They had great hopes for themselves. They feel like a failure. They feel like a failure in their marriage, or they feel like a failure in whatever way. And they have unreasonably high expectations of themselves, especially given the fact that they've been having to take so much energy just to heal from the abuse. And that has not given them the time or the energy to do maybe other things. Yes. And just an understanding and acceptance of that.
That's right. Can I ask you about the shadow piece? Because yes. I think, because I think as trauma survivors, we very much live in the either or, black or white. So it's hard for us, it was for me, I don't want to speak for anyone else, to embrace that yes, I feel love and at peace today, but there's always this shadow part, this voice in my head, or these thoughts that will pop up. And I think for many of us, we feel like for a long time it was like the bad part of me, like the part that I had to fight and feel embarrassed or ashamed of. But it doesn't have power. I don't act out on it. But and I don't think I'm a bad person for having it. But can you speak a little bit about that and how that's helpful to understand it for our journey?
Yeah. Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst in the time of Freud, and one of his major contributions was the concept of the shadow. And that's basically the idea that as children, we have to be socialized. We have to be taught that this is okay and this is not okay in order for our society to work. But in the process, we're told, say, for example, girls more often than boys are told that their anger is not okay. And boys are told that crying or weakness is not okay. And the way he described it is like we tuck those things away, or we put them in our pocket, or he described it as putting it in a bag and carrying it around with us. We reject those parts of ourselves that aren't acceptable to society or to our parents. But that doesn't mean they go away. They're still there. They're still there inside of us. And they pop out in various ways. Like they pop out, for example, anger can pop out as sarcasm or making fun of somebody else. Well, that's really an angry thing to do when you think about it. But if we don't give ourselves permission to be angry, we will resort to things like putting people down or being passive aggressive or making fun of people. So it's working with the shadow is actually just kind of giving ourselves permission to not be perfect, to not be either all good or all bad, and to admit that, yeah, I am angry. I am still angry about the abuse, and I need to focus on that and look at that and accept it so that I don't do it in indirect negative ways. That, for males, yes, I do feel sad and I do want to cry. And even though my father taught me that it was weakness to cry, I'm going to give myself permission to cry. So it's taking those rejected parts of ourselves and bringing them out into the light and looking at them and giving ourselves permission to have them. There's much more to it, but in terms of emotions, that's.
Yes. So, you talk, again, you mentioned compassion and self-compassion. Can you give us an example of what, like concrete steps for someone to do in terms of starting that practice?
Yeah. One thing is that to notice how often you're critical of yourself.
Okay.
To notice how often you put yourself down when you make a mistake. Some people actually hear a voice in their head that says, "Oh, you're stupid. Why did you do that? Why didn't you prepare more?" Or, really putting yourself down. And some people hear it. Other people just have an internal critic that causes them to feel like defeated or feel like a failure if they're not perfect. So to notice how you talk to yourself, how you treat yourself, what your expectations are of yourself. That's a beginning. And then instead of, if you actually hear a voice, it's easiest because then you can actually say something and back to that voice. You can either say, I did the best I could. If you've got a really kind of a loud voice and that's never gives up, some people have learned to talk back to that voice and say, just shut up. I don't want to hear it. I did the best I could. Just leave me alone.
Yes.
Other people have taken on another strategy, and that is to have compassion for that critical part of them. And to say to that critical part, why are you being so critical? What's going on with you that you're having to tell me that? And that gets a little bit more complicated. I wouldn't do that unless you're working with a therapist, because we're not talking about multiple personality or anything. We're just talking about kind of owning different parts of you. So there's various ways of working on it. But when you make a mistake, for example, instead of saying, I'm so stupid, what's wrong with me, putting yourself down, you could say, I feel bad that I didn't do a better job at that presentation. I'm really suffering. Compassion, the word suffering is really an important word because compassion is about addressing suffering, whether we're addressing the suffering of other people or we're addressing our own suffering. So to acknowledge, I feel really like a failure right now. I feel really sad that I didn't do a better job. So I'm really suffering. I'm going to be kind to myself today because I can tell that I'm really suffering. I'm going to be kind and be careful with myself today because this was kind of a blow to me that I didn't do a better job. Then you might want to offer, again, not as an excuse, but and when you look at it a little bit, I do understand why I didn't do such a good job. I didn't get a good night's sleep. I haven't been feeling well. So I'm going to be forgiving of myself for not doing the great job. I'm going to be understanding that, I tried, I did the best I could. Next time I will, try to get better sleep if I can, but I do understand why I was that way and I'm not perfect. So it's kind of a whole different way of talking to yourself instead of just putting yourself down.
Yeah. I think it's very good to hear you kind of talk this out. And I think for me, it was hard for me to hear because I think it was so ingrained in me, but it was more helpful for me to start to recognize I was feeling bad. Like I had to backtrack, what was the thought that led to the feeling? Because I wasn't so clear in the beginning about what was I thinking, what were the words that were running through my mind to make me feel this way. So I kind of worked my way backwards. So
yeah. And some people really need to address the expectation of being perfect. That nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect. I did the best I could. I'm not going to give myself that pressure to be perfect. So it depends on what your voices are saying.
Yeah.
But it's just generally a very kind way of talking to yourself. Kristen Neff mentioned that if you think of what self-compassion is, it's talking to yourself in the way a friend would talk to you, a good friend who's a loving, good friend, the way a person that you know who's very kind would talk to you, talking to yourself in the same way.
Great. So do you feel like the addiction piece ties into like the maybe when we can't control the negative self-talk, we find a way to shut it down or shut it off?
Well, the addiction piece goes back even further than that. It goes back to the shame.
Okay.
A lot of people have a family system where there's alcoholism, for example, but not everybody becomes alcoholic who come from those families. So there's that piece of it. But when someone's been deeply shamed by abuse, for example, they don't really feel like they're worth that much. It goes back to self-worth. So they're not worth that much, so they don't really care about themselves. So a healthier person might go out and get drunk when they're young and they're in high school and get drunk and throw up and feel horrible, and the next day and say to themselves, God, I don't like that feeling. I don't want to do that again. Whereas somebody who has really low self-esteem and no worth whatsoever, they don't go through the same process. They don't say, they might say, God, I feel terrible. I don't want to do that again. But it doesn't really mean anything because they're going to do it again because they don't have a sense that they're worth anything. Why shouldn't I? Why should I take care of myself? Why should I care about how I feel? I'm not worth anything. So that's an aspect of it. Another aspect is that it's self-medication. They feel so horrible about themselves. A lot of people talk about alcohol in terms of helping them socialize, because if you go out into the world and you're feeling full of shame, how are you going to relate to other people? How are you going to even talk to somebody and look at them in the eye and have some kind of relationship if you just feel so horrible about yourself? Especially, for example, with sexual abuse. Those who were sexually abused go out in the world, and I remember how I felt after I was abused. I remember feeling like horrible, just like a horrible monster, walking around my neighborhood looking for friends and feeling like I was just a terrible person and that no one would want me. And so if somebody mistreated me, it didn't feel to me like the wrong thing. They mistreated me, it must be my fault. That's why we have the title, because victims tend to blame themselves for any treatment they receive, not just the abuse, but after the abuse. When people start mistreating them, they just figure there must be me, must be something wrong with me. That's why this person is being mean to me. It must be something that they see in me that deserves this. So just to be able to go out to a party and hold your head up high and look somebody in the eye when you feel horrible shame, a lot of people will reach for a drink, and the drink will make them feel more confident, and it takes away their inhibitions, and so a lot of people get hooked on that, the good feelings that can come with alcohol or with drugs. And so they learn to self-medicate really early on to take away those bad feelings. That's
right. It takes a while, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So again, the self-forgiveness, because I know forgiveness is such a tough topic for us when we've been victimized by other people. And so can you speak to that? And both, if, people confuse, I have to forgive others in order to forgive myself, so what's the process that you help your clients through on the forgiveness?
Yeah. Well, again, it's goes through this whole process of self-understanding and self-acceptance first.
Yes.
But I don't even address forgiveness in the book, forgiving other people.
Okay.
When you forgive yourself, truly forgive yourself, Kristen Neff talks about the concept of common humanity, and what that means to her is that we look at the fact that nobody's perfect. We've all made mistakes. We've all hurt other people. and that there's always a reason why this person is this way. Now, she's talking about it in terms of forgiving other people, but she also talks about forgiving yourself too. But if we think about the fact that everybody has hurt someone else, and that there's always a reason for it. Again, it's not an excuse, but if you trace your own childhood, if you trace your own background, and you look at why you've done the things you've done, why did you not treat your children better? Or why were you even kind of abusive to your children? Why was that? You know, if we think of a child being born as an innocent human being that you know, is not good or bad, just innocent, and then we think about all the experiences that child had that created that person, that formed that person. Why would you grow up determined not to repeat your parents' abusive tendencies and end up repeating it? Why would you do that? Well, you wouldn't choose to do that. You do it because that's what happens with abuse victims. We do repeat the abuse. You didn't know what good parenting was. You had really high expectations placed on you, and so you tend to have high expectations of other people. You have a lot of rage inside you, so you tended to take that rage out on other people. There's reasons why you were the way you were. And if you can get a really deep understanding of that, it's a lot easier to forgive yourself. Okay? There's the piece about taking responsibility, too. Yeah. Some people need to take responsibility, and you hear this in 12-step programs like Making Amends, and I talk to people about how to apologize, specifically how to go about apologizing in a meaningful way so that you go to the person that you've harmed and you apologize and you let them know that you have a deep understanding of what you did. And you have a deep understanding of how you hurt them, and you validate their experience. One big important aspect for survivors, of course, is to have their experience validated. So you, in turn, validate to the people you've hurt that, yes, I did hurt you, and you have reason to be angry with me, or you have reason to be afraid of me, or you have reason to not want to be around me. And I know that. And you show remorse, and you show them, I really do feel badly about it. I wish I had not done that to you. And then you say, is there any way I can make up for it, or any way I can help you? Can I pay for your therapy? Can I, what can I do to help help you with your pain about what I have done. So sometimes we always need to take responsibility, but sometimes we also actually need to kind of earn our own forgiveness by going and apologizing to other people. And sometimes it's just absolutely a spiritual practice when you think about whatever your beliefs are about spirituality and about God, and about God's forgiveness. It's harder for people who were raised with a God who's punishing than it is for someone who was raised with God who's forgiving, but there's probably an avenue of spirituality that can help you with that. So I just provide various ways, but basically it needs to come back to an understanding that you can't be perfect, that being human means we're going to make mistakes. And then when people can forgive themselves, very often that does help them to forgive others when they're ready.
So do you feel like it's people are having an easier time forgiving others when they have forgiven themselves, right?
Often.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you say to those then? Because, sometimes you feel people are like adamant, or it's almost like they're stuck, because they're not getting validation from the people they want the validation from, that they're kind of holding, and living in a holding pattern, so to speak, that they're not going to move on until they get, that validation from the person that hurt them. And for some of us, that may never happen.
Right. Well, that's where self-compassion comes in. If you really can talk to yourself or write yourself a self-compassionate letter where you acknowledge what happened to you, where you talk to yourself as that kind, loving friend who says, I'm sorry that you were sexually abused. I'm sorry that you suffered because of it. I feel your suffering. I feel badly for you. If you can write a self-compassionate letter, you might not stay as stuck in expecting to hear it from the person who harmed you. Mm-hmm. There's a really great exercise that I do it in groups, and it's most impactful in groups, but I also do it with individuals, and it's an exercise in the book, and that is, think about, what did you want to hear after your abuse experiences? What words would you have wanted to hear from somebody right after you were abused? And then secondarily, what would you have wanted them to do? Would you have wanted them to hug you, or would you have wanted them just to sit quietly with you? What would you have wanted the person to do? So you think about a kind person that you've had in your life, and what words could that kind person say to you, and you write down what words you wanted to hear. And in the group, what I do is I have people write down the words they wish they had heard, and then I collect all those pieces of paper, and I have people sitting in one group sitting in a circle in a chair, and the other group standing behind them. And the people standing behind them go around and stand behind the person, and they say the words they wish they had heard.
Wow.
So the person sitting there is going to hear everybody's wish of what they heard. Some of those messages will resonate with them. So they're going to hear in their ear, "I'm sorry that happened to you," or "It wasn't your fault," or "I wish I was there with you," or "You were just an innocent child." So they hear, as people pass behind them, they hear all these messages, and it's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly, healing for people. But people individually can do it by writing down what they wish they had heard, and then telling themselves those words, becoming the kind, loving person they wish they'd had in their life, and telling themselves those words, either verbally and hugging themselves. What do they want to have happen? I wanted someone to tell me it wasn't my fault and to hold me. So you tell yourself it wasn't your fault, and you hold yourself. Okay. And I'm making it overly simplistic, and it's harder than that. But there's the idea that there's got to be at least one person in your life who was kind to you, and think about that person, and think about how that person was kind to you. How did they look at you? How did they treat you? What did they say? And then you take on those qualities when you deal with yourself. You take on those qualities either when you're hearing your critical inner voice, or when you're putting yourself down, or whenever you're suffering, you take on those qualities and talk to yourself in that way. Some people can't even think of somebody who was kind, so they think about the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa, or it was really funny. Somebody asked me years ago, to think of a kind person, and I thought of the Good Witch in the Wizard of Oz. The one that has the quivering voice. "Oh, well, Beverly, that was the voice that came to me.
Yes.
I didn't use that in the future, but in that moment, that's what came to me. So everybody has a concept of a kind person, and we work to help them start to treat themselves in that same kind way.
That's great. Thank you so much for laying that out. That was beautiful, simple, but impactful at the same time.
Yeah,
I can imagine the powerful feeling of having those words repeated. Because like you said, maybe some of those resonated, and maybe someone said something that we didn't even think about or we wanted to hear, and then there it was. So
right.
That's beautiful. And that's what I love about what you're sharing, is that there's a lot of things that we can do, because for so long we felt so disconnected and broken and shamed. And so there was no use in even trying or to bother learning new things about ourselves. And everything that you really have shared is something that we can do on our own. But that's also what I wanted to ask you about your book. And, our time's coming to an end here soon, but is that something that people can use on their own, or do you recommend they work it through it with a therapist, or how do you recommend your book being used?
Yeah. Well, I write self-help books, so I always think that If there are a lot of people, I really believe in therapy and in support groups. And if you can afford therapy, if you have a therapist nearby that you can trust, that's been recommended to you, if there's support groups nearby. So I always recommend counseling, but there are so many people that can't afford it or don't feel safe enough to reach out to people or live in remote areas where there aren't counselors. So I write self-help books so that people can get the help that they need with the book.
Yes.
So it's a program that you actually can practice self-compassion, learn how to practice self-compassion by reading the book, yes.
That's great. And so it is a workbook in a sense also.
Yes, it has exercises in it. I always have exercises in my books because I think it's important. And people have given me feedback that those people who read the book first and didn't do the exercises and then went back into the exercises found that they got so much more out of it.
Yes.
So the exercises are really important.
Yeah, of course. It's like we get the education in here, but it's not until we connect to it emotionally, right? We bring it really home to how it applies to us, and then take that loving action, right, through self-compassion. Right. That's really where the change takes place. So that's wonderful. So I have your website here. You shared that the audience, after listening to us today, can find you on your website, beverlyengel.com, for more information. And your email is beverly@beverlyengel.com. Right. And are all your books for sale on your website?
No, I don't sell them on my website. They're all available on Amazon. Okay. Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of the booksellers.
On any of the booksellers. Any other of your books that you feel like would be appropriate for our audience? I know probably all of them are.
Well, Healing Your Emotional Self is probably the best book I've ever written. And it's definitely, it's for survivors of any kind of abuse. And it's really, really helpful to everyone who's been abused in some way, especially emotionally abused.
Okay. All right. And any last parting words in terms of, because I know victims, they can feel disappointed in how long it takes, or is it ever going to be over? I mean, you've been at it for a lot of years. What kind of encouragement can you give to the people that maybe are learning about you and hearing and just starting their journey?
Yeah. Well, to look for the ways you are changing. Pay attention to the ways you are changing. And if you're not noticing change, ask your friends or ask your family members if they notice anything about you that's different. Because sometimes we don't see it. And sometimes we're just looking at one issue, like I want to solve this problem and become different in this way. And we don't see all the other ways that we are changing. So, look in the present at what you're changing and not always just looking in the future.
Okay. That's a good idea, because I can relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't notice. It's like we're too close to ourselves, right? We don't see it. So
right. And if you haven't resolved an issue, just know that there's good reason, that you're not just being stubborn or stupid or lazy or whatever. There's something there that you still need to address or you still need to work on. And you need to be patient with yourself, and compassionate with yourself.
Exactly. Have that self-compassion that your healing journey will unfold in your natural time, right? Your authentic timing. So it's important that we respect that, because we live in a quick fix culture, right?
Absolutely.
Where we expect to read the book and there we are, all fixed.
Right.
It doesn't quite happen that way.
Right.
So, well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated my time here with you. A lot of good information. I'm definitely going to get a copy of your book because, for myself, and I also know a lot of the people that I work with struggle with the shame, and like when you mentioned just what does shame feel like. I can reflect on some key turning points on my healing journey where the shame, it felt like almost like a warm wash kind of coming up, and it's like starting to recognizing it and seeing that I was at a turning point, that the decision that I was going to make in that moment about myself and maybe some relationships, was I going to do it from that place, or was I going to sit and let it just roll over me, breathe into it, let it go, and then from a whole place, decide what was best for me instead of from the place that I needed to hide or cover up something. So,
right. Yeah, shame is about feeling exposed.
Yes.
That feeling of being of your deficits, your faults, your shortcomings suddenly being exposed to everybody.
Yes.
That's the feeling of shame. Like all of a sudden, if you're standing there and your pants just fell down, that's the sense, is that I'm now, everybody sees who I really am.
Yes.
And so many times survivors will feel like they're pretending their way through life, and pretending to be somebody they're not. And whenever they feel exposed, it's a horrible feeling.
Yes. It's a very, very vulnerable. And when we don't have strengths inside of us, when we know who we are,
Right.
have some good qualities,
Yes.
then we feel like it's all for nothing, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think we could go on and talking about that, for it definitely resonates here, this conversation. But I really want to thank you again for your time and the amazing work that you do. You've written 21 books. A lot of us are just coming out with our first one. So thank you for, making it so for the rest of us. And from one survivor to another, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you're doing and all the people that you're helping, because I know when you help one of us, it gives others permission to follow. And I think kind of collectively, more and more of us are coming up with the realization that we can heal and we can restore. And that's why I'm doing this summit. I feel like the good news, we need to get out the good news that we can survive, get way past surviving and thriving. So
yes, thank you for doing this. Thank you for your work.
Very welcome. So thank you very much again.
Okay.